Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final segment for week 12 here on Chapter 7, with one more lecture video to go for Chapter 7 for next week before we move into Chapter 8. And of course, we're again talking today about principles for testing and training for anaerobic power for Chapter 7. And we'll talk mostly about some of the testing in regards to anaerobic power for the most part, saving most of our prescription and programming for the final lecture for next week. That said, blood lactate change and training stimulus. Understanding that as blood lactate develops, of course, that affects the differences in our energy system used, and of course, it affects our ability to keep performing. Normal resting levels of blood lactate are around 0.5, half to 1 millimeters per mol per liter. Now, as you increase a progressive exercise, we've kind of talked about this before, with increasing ATP demand, there's an increased demand upon anaerobic metabolism as exercise intensity, of course, increases, right? Now, as that intracellular lactate increases, its high concentration causes its release from the cell along with excess hydrogen ions. And of course, the point where the blood lactate concentrations due to the excess hydrogen ions and the lactate rapidly developing, or where it starts to rapidly increase, I should say, is that place called the lactate inflection point, or OBLA, LTAT, often referred to synonymously. Technically, the OBLA, the onset of blood lactate accumulation, that first point where it starts that just before the beginning of that rapid increase there, that happens right before the lactate threshold. Lactate threshold happens right after, and the anaerobic threshold, because it's actually technically not blood related to gas exchange, technically occurs a little bit after that, but they're so close to each other that they're often referred synonymously between the three of them. And a typical expectation for that lactate threshold or the onset of blood lactate accumulation is around 4 millimeters mol per liter. And that said, that training tolerance and progression is going to be different for each person. Some people around that level are not going to be fatigued, and they're going to be able to keep performing at a high rate of performance. Some people will have already fatigued at that point, or at least be showing decrease in performance because that's too high of a concentration. That's more of an average number as opposed to the expectation that you have the same measurement for everyone in their blood lactate development. The blood lactate development level would be the same as it's not for everyone at their level of performance decline, or where they start to have some decline in performance due to excess hydrogen ions and blood lactate in the blood, or lactate in the blood. Now, remembering our key parameters for measuring intensity, because we can't always take blood, which would be really nice to be able to get a feel for what's going on, run by maybe, and then quickly have a pin prick of your finger so the blood can be taken as you run by would be ideal. That being said, or in the pool, somehow I could do something like that. Fantastic. Or on a bike, right? That's not necessarily reasonable to expect that. So the measurements we have typically in performance are heart rate, pace, the speed you're going, your actual performance essentially, and RPE. I was pleased that the book actually mentioned that, because we often talk a lot about heart rate and RPE. People talk a lot about heart rate, sometimes don't use it enough. Pace, of course, measuring your actual performance, and RPE is not measured enough, actually just measuring subjective response to stress. We want to make sure we don't confuse our effort with our output. The end goal of performance in general is the performance itself. So we have to be clear about what the goals are for the performance when we prescribe an exercise. We pick specifically parameters for frequency, intensity, time, type, rest, and of course our rate of progression, where we're choosing all these things. We have to be picking our end goal and being clear about our expectations when we watch someone exercise. This may seem kind of general, seem like being obvious, but I think it's often not. And I think coaching in general, or training with people, it's often missed, and we get too caught up in just the mass total of everything happening without actually really measuring performance. Anything that's actually can be timed should be timed, so we actually can be clear about how far someone got distance-wise in a given time, or if we're going for a given distance, how long that time took to get that distance covered. So we're always talking about force and distance, generally speaking, as we talk about, of course, work, and as it relates to strength or performance. That's kind of when we talk about pace is what I'm referring to. Some aspect of force and or distance, typically both, right? Heart rate, want to be measuring really, I think I put it right here. measuring our heart rate. Basically, if you have a heart rate monitor, which would be perfect world, everybody's got a little transmitter on their chest for the most accurate measurement of heart rate. The ones that are measuring at your wrist just aren't typically as accurate at higher intensities over longer periods. There could be some variability there by a few percentage points or more. It's better than not having anything, and certainly can be useful, and you can actually test it to see if it's accurate for a particular person. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't be. The one around the chest is probably going to be more accurate consistently, but then you have to wear that transmitter around the chest. That's understood as not being ideal for some people to want to wear that, or lacking equipment, in which case, either way, taking the heart rate as soon as a set ends, right off the bat, taking it for 6 seconds, and then multiply by that 10, and then you don't count the very first beat, by the way. So if you're measuring for 6 seconds, you get 10, it's actually 9. You don't measure the half beat, you're measuring as someone says, go, right? You don't measure the first beat, measure every beat that happens after that, multiply by 10, that's your heart rate. And then right before the next set begins, ideally take the heart rate again so you're clear about the expectation of what the heart rate should come down to before beginning the next set. How do we know what the right heart rate is? Well, that next set, were they able to perform at a level equal to or better than the previous set? If they were, then whatever heart rate they reached before they began that next set was appropriate. At least for that particular set it was. Now, it would be surprising to note that the next set after that, going into like the third set and beyond, we would expect to often see a higher heart rate, assuming the rest periods are the same and the work period expectation time-wise is the same, or distance covered is the same, or load you're lifting is the same, any of those factors, then we would expect to see a rise in heart rate over time. And of course, with that rise in heart rate, there's the risk, or not risk, but the possibility performance might decline. If performance declines, we have to decide what we want here. Do you want to see performance declining, which my argument is going to be 99% of the time, no. The 1% is, for whatever reason, you're trying to get someone mentally through a state. Unfortunately, take that too often to extremes, pushing someone for the purpose of mental performance, and we put excessive stress on them from a physiological perspective, which is not going to help us physiologically develop. There's a time and a place for that mental training, so to speak, but it shouldn't be on a regular basis all the time, overloading to the point, not overloading from a standpoint of the principle of overload, but overload, I guess you could really say, excessive overload, right, towards overreaching and then eventually overtraining. But what should happen is the heart rate may go up a little bit, and that's fine, but they better be able to have that same performance each successive set. If not, the choice needs to be made to not either to call it, which probably is what should be done today if you get to a set and they couldn't perform as well, or give them one more set on top of that with a little bit longer rest, or a shorter work period, or adjust the intensity of the work period or duration of the work period so that they can actually accomplish it. Depends on the goal. If the goal is to get the performance, then maybe increase the rest a little bit, see if they can actually meet that performance goal. But if you don't think you can do that, then call it for the day and adjust the next training protocol or next prescription for the next time you train. In RPE, you want to be taking into account the first time you start measuring RPE for someone, you don't really know what you're getting. Someone says, my RPE is 7 on a scale 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. The old Borg scale of rate of perceived exertion is absolutely fine and it's more accurate, but it's 6 to 20 related to what would be equivalent to 60 heart rate to about 200 heart rate. It's accurate, but it's not going to be as easy to be able for someone to be able to tell 7 or 15. It's harder for someone to gauge. So that's why we often use, I should say, the 1 to 10 ratio as opposed to 6 to 20, that range. Okay. That said, you can absolutely use the old Borg scale, and that's perfectly fine. But using RPE for subjective interpretation of someone's intensity, heart rate for someone's actual intensity, heart rate doesn't lie. Okay. And of course, actual performance intensity measured, objective measure with pace. So you've got 2 objective measures and 1 subjective measure to be used on a regular basis for every set to get a clear idea about whether you're meeting your goals of your training, whether someone can handle that particular stimulus, or whether it's too much. Lactate clearance must occur between sets for optimal performance to occur. If the expectation is more of an aerobic performance where it's lower intensity, lower expectation of output, having shorter rests whereby you maybe haven't completely cleared lactate may not be as big of a deal from the standpoint of not needing to have 100% ATP back. 70% ATP may be just fine with a 30-second rest, which is typical. 70% ATP is typical for recovery in about 30 seconds for the majority of people. After about 90 seconds, pretty consistent with about 90% ATP for most, or at least 85, 90%. And with the elite, 100% ATP can be recovered after high intensity exercise with only 90 seconds rest. When I say high intensity, maximal intensity is what I mean. 95, 100% output. Like someone sprinting for a few seconds and they can rest in 90 seconds, come back and do it again. Same sprint or better, 5 seconds or less. That's highly unusual. Most people are going to need closer to 3 to 5 minutes to get that 100% ATP back. We'll talk more about that. We haven't talked about it yet, but I'm going to keep reiterating those general numbers for being good guidelines. There's no exact here, but they're really pretty darn good numbers with a lot of research to back the expectation for them. That said, low intensity exertion is almost always advisable after higher intensity type sets, glycolytic type sets where there's significant lactate development, right? And of course, between sets, we're not just between days, but being active with low intensity exercise, but between sets, moving. Something really light, something that someone could probably do what we would call well below lactate threshold. Of course, you don't want to develop levels of lactate increasing here or increasing excess hydrogen ions. You're trying to clear the lactate, remove the excess hydrogen ions, and we want to stimulate circulation. So what we're really trying to do is move at a low enough intensity or low enough stimulus. You're stimulating blood flow to those areas. You're moving the same areas you were moving before. This is vital. The same general movements. Doesn't have to be the same exact exercise. Doesn't have to be keep having dumbbells in your hands or keep sprinting, but you're walking, right? Or if you're loaded, you're doing something loaded at much lower intensity, trying to recover by keeping those muscles still active, but so active at a level of intensity, you could probably do it for several minutes without being fatigued at all. That's the intensity we're looking for between sets when we're trying to achieve lactate clearance for a successive set. Okay, and some sort of activity is always advisable for when we're talking about glycolytic type work versus being still to avoid venous pooling, whereby all the blood flow has gone to those areas, and whether it's typically in our periphery, right, typically our limbs, our arms or our legs, and you have essentially all the blood rushing to those areas, which is normal. You get that blood, that pump people often talk about, and you have insufficient venous return. You actually have blood pooling there, and you actually have increased probability of stiffness and soreness and inflammation over time if you don't try to remove that sooner rather than later. The sooner you do it, the sooner you can get back to performance, especially if we're trying to go for another set. We don't want that to be the case. You want to be in bloated or feeling that bloated or heavy feeling before you get to the next set. That's not ideal for performance in any way, shape, or form. Our training sessions in general. Intervals. We talked a little about this with aerobic intervals. Aerobic intervals would simply be more longer periods of time, that 3 to 10 minutes or beyond work periods, typically speaking for typical aerobic type periods. And then rest periods can be very, very short, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, sometimes as long as 60 seconds, but that's a little long. Maybe no rest at all. Then maybe the intervals aren't even necessarily needed. But the whole purpose for intervals in the first place is you're trying to accomplish a lot of work, but you can't ask for that super high intensity for long periods. So instead, what you're trying to do is have short periods of high intensity and eventually trying to add up to the amount of total work you're looking for. So we got to be clear about that, not just randomly say 3 sets, 6 sets, 8 sets. That's commonly done. We often hear 3 sets is such a common thing. 3 or 4 sets, typical. I know when I'm typically having people do anaerobic work, if they can't do at least 4 sets, I don't think of what we're referring to as high level intensity anaerobic type work. I don't think they're ready for anaerobic type work. They need to be doing more aerobic training and building up their tolerance for exercise, more of the moderate level intensities for going to high intensities if they can't do at least 4 sets of a reasonable expectation. You can argue, of course, if they couldn't do 4 sets, maybe the stimulus for expectation of a distance they needed to be covering or the time at which they had to cover some distance was not fair, so consequently they couldn't do 4 sets. That has to be looked at too, of course. But that said, that concept of the 1930s fartlek, that speed play, fast, slow, there's no, as it was noted before, there's a Swedish term referring to any measure of fast, slow. It could be anything. We're talking about high intensity. Well, an interval wouldn't necessarily be a typical referring to like a fartlek is typically more glycolytic, honestly. Glycolytic toward aerobic, not typically more of our ATP, CP type performances. So I want to be clear about that too. But technically an interval could be anything, right? Anaerobic wise, we're typically referring to work periods of definitely 2 minutes or less, probably more likely for the most optimal glycolytic performances, 20 to 60 second work periods. And for the optimal, for the ATP, CP, not more than 10, 20 seconds, probably even less than 10 seconds ideally. Doesn't mean you can't go longer, depends upon sports needs or performance needs. but we got to be clear about what energy system we're using, what muscle fiber types we're using, and what our end goal is. And that said, with energy systems, we're talking about that 1 to 10 seconds-ish range. We're typically talking about adenosine triphosphate, creatine phosphate, the phosphagen system. We're talking about maximal force outputs of 95 to 100% force output. We're talking about rest periods of 3 to 5 minutes for gaining back 95 to 100% ATP, typically needing 3 to 5 minutes. Could be as little as 90 seconds, but typically speaking, that's what we're looking at. Muscle fiber types for those 1 to 10 second work periods, or less than 10 seconds, I should say, is typically type 2X predominant muscle fibers with some type 2A. Depends to some extent what intermix we have there. Doesn't mean type 1 muscle fiber is not involved, but that's not the predominant muscle fiber, at least not if we're going to get maximal output, we should say. You could jog at a super low intensity for 10 seconds and be using only type 1 muscle fibers. But if we're talking about your maximal output capability, that's not what muscle fiber is going to be dominant. It's going to be type 2X / type 2A secondarily. And of course, for glycolytic type performances, typically speaking, referred to about 20 seconds, 30 seconds and beyond, even arguably as little as 10 seconds for glycolysis being the predominant energy system, up to about 2 or 3 minutes. But typical work periods of 20 seconds to 120 seconds, with the most optimal benefit for high intensity type sets, with glycolytic performances seeming to be in that 20 to 60 second work period. But understanding the shorter we go on the work period, the higher the intensity expectation. What we're assuming here, the rest period's got to be longer, not shorter. Too often people try to do these super high intensity sets with short breaks. Well, it'll feel difficult, but your actual performance output will not be high output. What's the goal? The perception of this is hard or actual high output, right? And that's important to note too. That being said, make sure we're clear about our expectations there. And kind of what I mentioned, and reminding myself here, that we generally speaking, when we have shorter work periods, we're expecting higher intensities, generally speaking. When we expect higher intensities or shorter work periods, we should expect to have longer rest periods. Likewise, if we're expecting longer duration work periods, we're going to have lower force output. We're not going to have the same maximal outputs. So consequently, we would expect less rest. Okay, those are good general guidelines. You can adjust that depending upon training needs for a given sport. That's understandable, but that's what we call conditioning for sport, not necessarily training specific parameters toward speed or power or endurance. There are differences there. Training for your actual sport, conditioning segment should occur only for brief periods during your training year, preferably coming into the competitive type phases. Otherwise, those kinds of competition level stresses shouldn't be occurring throughout your year with any regularity. You're using that basically in the final weeks / maybe 2-3 months leading into, maybe a little longer, all depending on the athlete and the sport, leading into the primary competition phase. Okay. That said, resistance training, resistance testing and training. It's often said when you talk about strength training, cardiovascular training, resistance training, right? And you kind of go, which one's which exactly? Well, the book actually does a good job of actually noting aerobic training. Anaerobic training is probably a better way to go, because there you could do strength training, go in the gym and be lifting a weight that you could handle for minutes long, and technically that's aerobic training, but it is also resistance training, right? Likewise, you can perform, you can actually go out and go for a run, but maybe you can only run at that given speed, or a swim or a cycling for 30 seconds to 60 seconds, in which case you might think that's cardiovascular exercise, which you're not wrong. There's some benefit there no matter what. Either way, it's also resistance training and it's cardiovascular oriented, but at the same time, that's more glycolytic type work. That's actually probably more anaerobic. So we have to understand there's some crossover in here for the way we refer to these terms. Your book shows resistance training. I've often heard some people say strength training. I catch myself saying strength training versus cardiovascular training, kind of breaking it down that way. But we want to be really clear and simply ask people, what do you mean specifically? What are you trying to accomplish with this? So we're clear about what we're talking about. There's always going to be some challenge with terminology there. In this case, the book referring to the Irvine text, referring to strength, power, and endurance as muscular fitness type potential goals, and like we said, resistance training, it is, absolutely. It's used for talking about this form of training or strength training, like we think about typical gym training, where you go to the gym and you're lifting weights on machines, free weights, bands, tubing, cable machines, any sort of external loaded resistance, typically speaking here, we're typically talking about. For performance, for health and fitness, let alone for sport, with goals of increased bone density. And we mentioned before, aerobic training gets you bone density increases too. However, the higher the loads, the greater the compressive forces. And the higher loads, the greater compressive forces, assuming someone can handle those forces. With compressive forces, remember we're talking about walking, jogging, running, jumping, overhead pressing, chest pressing, squats, deadlifts, lunges, anything that's actually compressive force activities whereby you are resisting directly the pull of the opposing pull, from a standpoint of compressing load through bone, not across it, like you'd get from like an arm curl, which would be a distraction force exercise, not compressive force activity. Okay. But that's the best way to build bone too, right? High loads, low speeds. Okay. Because you can't move high loads at high speeds. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a high load. Strength or force output, want to be clear about what our expectations are for force output, but this certainly, from a standpoint of resistance training, is going to, from a higher level, concerning anaerobic type training for strength training, is certainly going to help improve strength or maximal force outputs. Improve body composition, we say it's, and I like how it refers to improved body composition from the standpoint that it's not an exact body fat we're looking for, although typically speaking, low teens for males and high teens for females are very typical for athletic populations in a lot of sports. When you get down into the single-digit body fat categories, what you're typically looking at for longer durations of time is lower testosterone levels. And that's why anybody who's the size of a house that weighs 240 pounds and they're 5'8", and they're a bodybuilder, and they say their body fat's 4%, there's no chance. There's no chance. If they're a 4% body fat, they'd have such low body fat, they'd have a low testosterone count. If they had a low testosterone count, they would not have the muscle mass they do. So that's their body fat's closer to probably 9, 10, 11, 12. That being said, it's really inconsequential from a standpoint of that they get the mass they want, they look good, that's their primary goal. But you're going to have high testosterone levels and high muscle mass. You can't have too low of a level of body fat. But the increased metabolic rate that comes with increased, not so much improved, doesn't really come so much with improved body composition by itself, other than the fact that when you have less body fat and more muscle mass relative to body fat, and therefore increased ability to produce force, you can do more things with less effort. Consequently, you can do more work as a whole and go for longer durations without fatigue. All those things lead to greater metabolic rate. But in general, to increase the metabolic rate, we're talking about the duration and or intensity of exertion. And generally speaking, you cannot match up with an endurance athlete for metabolic rate from the standpoint of if they could put in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours of exercise for like an ultra endurance type athlete, nobody can match up with a metabolism like that. You can't do it. We often say, well, I go to practice for 2 or 3 hours a day. You're not going constantly for 2 or 3 hours. They're going over some drills here, taking a break, moving over here, doing something else different over here. You're switching and transitioning from one thing into the next. Otherwise, it'd just be an aerobic workout, which is exactly what an endurance athlete is doing, and thereby going to be ultimately, because of the longer duration of their activity for many, many hours and never stopping, they're going to have a higher metabolic rate. It's just plain and simple, certainly pound for pound. Okay. That said, reduce musculoskeletal injury, assuming the proper motions are incurred, and the proper loads, the proper rests, all those things. But just the regular activity is unquestionably going to help reduce musculoskeletal injury, as long as we're not overtraining, right, or overreaching. There's a reduced risk of heart disease and premature death, kind of important stuff for general fitness, not just sport. And actually, a lot of research has shown that low strength, having low capacity to produce force, is very highly related or correlated to metabolic syndrome. What you're not going to find is someone who has metabolic syndrome and they have high levels of strength. It just doesn't happen. So consequently, what they have with the metabolic syndrome, by the way, of course, along with low strength, it doesn't mean one thing's going to happen because of the other, but one thing does often lead to another, and increased risk of heart disease is what we typically find with someone with metabolic syndrome or stroke and type 2 diabetes. And that's due to increased waist size, increased blood pressure, and blood sugar levels over time. And of course, with regular exercise, we increase insulin sensitivity, I should say, of the body, consequently whereby the body doesn't secrete more insulin than it needs. It doesn't overreact by secreting too much insulin. It doesn't have issues to try to figure out how much insulin to secrete. There are not any deficiencies there. So you consequently have a very, very efficient system hormonally in good balance. Blood pressure is normal, not too high, and waist size would theoretically, of course, not be as high either with proper regular activity. And of course, you can always counteract that with poor choices in rest and and poor nutrition, that's not going to help. But theoretically, at least if you're doing reasonable levels of those things and significant exercise, you won't have such high of a risk for metabolic syndrome. General strength goals for strength and/or endurance, let alone power. First of all, flexibility and mobility. Flexibility is the ability to achieve a full range of motion at a joint. So total body flexibility would be the ability to achieve full ranges of motion at all joints. Okay, be pretty unusual for many people to be in that category. There are some, but typically speaking, you're pretty flexible in one area and not so much in the other, or unfortunately, flexible one side, not the other. That lack of symmetry can really be problematic for injuries down the road if you don't already have them. People who have great deficiencies left to right, left side versus right side, or right side versus left side, either way, usually have significant numbers of injuries if they engage in regular activity. And if they don't engage in regular activity, they have problems in general health-wise, right? But mobility, as opposed to flexibility, is the ability to move through a full range of motion with control, to move with control, to control motion, not just to move through into a given direction to a given range of motion, but to have control of motion and therefore be able to produce force at least relatively efficiently in a lot of different directions and a lot of different movements. So if you're mobile, you're also flexible, but you could be flexible and not yet mobile, right? If you're not flexible at all, you're definitely not mobile. But balance is not just the ability to stand on one leg like some people do, which is fine if that's their goal. If it's important for a given sport or a given level of performance to be able to stand on one leg, then do so. But when we talk about balance, what we're really talking about is your ability to maintain your position in space through someone giving some resistance, or you being basically trying to maintain your position against resistance, showing balance in that. And of course, bodily symmetry left to right, really, really important to be considering when training strength-wise or any form of training. There's balance, or at least as much balance as possible, left to right, because down the road that can create some really inherent injuries. Some things can't be helped. Some sports you're inherently going to use one side more than the other, because that's just the way that it is for that particular sport or for a particular performance needed. But the more symmetry you get from a health standpoint and well-being and longevity standpoint, that's vital. The increased ability to perform activities of daily living, to be able to get up and down and not get tired. And unfortunately, we've all seen people, and hopefully not in that category yet, but we've all had days or moments whereby you don't want to do things. I don't want to get up and go do the dishes, or to take dishes out of the dishwasher and put them up. It sounds very draining. It sounds tiring. It sounds fatiguing. Those kinds of things. First of all, being tired and being fatigued, and secondly, having the flexibility, the mobility, and the basic strength to perform some of those activities. Reduced risk of future disease and injury, as we mentioned a little bit before here. The more regular activities are accomplished with proper strength levels and proper and/or endurance levels, hopefully both, let alone power, should have a decreased incidence of disease and injury, theoretically. Now, skeletal muscle performance, actual specific skeletal muscle as it relates to the motions you're engaging on a regular basis in relationship to the loads you're working, or the resistance you're working against, whether you're in the pool or on a bike or on land. All those things are different. So it's going to be not just the motions themselves a little bit different, the resistance is different, so the training effect is not the same, which is why we can't expect the same benefits across multiple aspects of training like that, like land, water, and on wheels, so to speak. Okay. But that said, skeletal muscle performance is affected by the fiber size and recruitment patterns. In terms of size principle of recruitment is the smallest number of muscle fibers is recruited first, the least amount of fibers, and the smallest fibers, both. So what you're really looking at is your type 1 muscle fibers are the first ones to recruit. And then the type 2A and type 2X kick in, generally speaking, in order, 2A then 2X. However, when we're trying to recruit for power, we're trying to actually decrease that time from the type 1, type 2A, type 2X to being almost instantaneous. And the body can be trained that way. Neurally, we're looking for neural adaptation in this case, whereby the neurons firing much more efficiently, much quicker, greater myelination, basically those nerve fibers, so that actually that communication can become more and more fluid and actually become much more of a natural, fast, reactive response. And of course, fiber size, type 2X being the largest fibers, type 2A being more between fibers, and type 1 being the smallest fibers, all of which can hypertrophy, all of which can grow in size, because when you grow in performance, they're growing in size, at least performances that are 6 weeks and longer from when you've been training and you're still seeing performance improvements. You're probably getting combinations of both neural and hypertrophic benefit. the benefits you get in the first 6 to 12 weeks, somewhere in there in the first 6 to 12 weeks of engaging in particular exercises or things you haven't done in a long time or ever. Most of your gains, if not all of them, at least certainly in the first 4 to 6 weeks, are neural based. They're not based in hypertrophy. They're based in neural responses, better communication between the nervous system and the musculoskeletal muscle system or muscular system, so that you have the right neurons firing, the right number of fibers, and the right fibers in the right sequence at the right time, those things. Fiber type, well, you kind of talked about there, and that neural input, driving the right exercise to meet the purpose that you're looking for. Specificity is key, and that, of course, is going to lead to our specific adaptation to imposed demands, which theoretically should be appropriate because we've specifically picked the right exercise. Now, assuming we've had all of our variables programmed appropriately and performance has occurred like it should, we get the appropriate SED. You're going to do something which is going to be, by doing it, that's specific to, it's hopefully specific to your goal, but it's going to be specific to the benefit you get, and your response is always the SED. Always. You're always going to get a SED. You're going to get a specific adaptation to imposed demands. Whether it's what you wanted is going to depend upon all the variables you program and the way that you perform them. And the metabolism, as we mentioned, will go up with greater levels of activity. Certainly, if you increase more muscle mass, you'll see an increase in metabolism, but not at the level that people talk about. A lot of people will say things like, say research, not so much research, but people will actually make claims, and research does not support it, that you can be gaining 50 calories or more of metabolic gain for every pound of muscle you have. So that would imply that if you had 10 pounds of muscle more, you'd be burning 500 extra calories every single day just sitting still. And that's just not true. If you're not engaging in regular activity, now your muscles will certainly be they're a greater consumer than fat is, for sure. So the more muscle you have, you will certainly have a higher metabolic rate, but not to that same level. Probably more closer to 5 to 7, 8, 9 calories per every pound of muscle per day, not a significant amount. The goal for getting muscle is not to increase metabolism. The goal for getting muscle is to increase force output, to increase performance, to decrease injury, things we've already talked about, not metabolism. To increase metabolism, you got to increase into activity as a whole. Be more regularly active on a regular basis. Frequency being the most important factor, right? Absolute strength is the maximal capacity to exert force. In most circles, absolute strength is just referred to as your 1 rep max, your absolute max. Well, to be really clear, your competitive max will always be higher than your absolute max. Your absolute max is not necessarily in a competitive setting. At least if we're talking about a competitive person or a competitive athlete, when you're actually in your sport, in a game situation or a actual or a championship game for that matter, the ultimate or penultimate basically moment in sport or in performance, you're going to be at a level where, assuming you're ready for it, you could never simulate and never get the same level on your own. You just couldn't. So when someone can actually run just as fast as their goal is going to be in a competition, or they can lift a load in practice that they need to be able to lifting in a competition, there's a good chance, assuming all things are going well in their performance and preparation leading up to the competition, they're going to be doing well above that, because competitive max also incorporates a lot of other things psychologically from the standpoint of motivation, from the standpoint of then neural input, from the standpoint of better neural response, not just hypertrophy, a benefit that increases their responses by 5-10% or more sometimes. So I want to make sure we're clear. Competitive maximum was not mentioned by your text, but competitive max in athletic circles is well known to be above the absolute max from a general standpoint of typical training. Maximal power is the ability to exert greater force over significant distances, but more importantly, to do it in less and less time. If you increase your ability to produce force, you're going to increase power. If you move at greater distances, you're going to increase power. But ultimately, the greatest factor is doing it in less time. And that is a question on your exam, and many people missed it. And that was something I mentioned in one of the previous PowerPoints as well, that maximal power, the biggest difference between power and strength is the amount of time in which you produce force. Power is actually producing significant force very, very quickly, whereas strength is just the ability to produce force and move it over greater distances, hopefully, as well. Because work is basically force times distance. That said, basic muscular actions, concentric actions, acceleration. Muscle shortens under resistance. So as you do an arm curl and you bring that load up, you're bringing your essentially your wrist towards your shoulder, and your muscle is shortening under load. That's the concentric action of of your motion, okay, of your exercise, I should say, the concentric action during exercise. A lot of people refer to it as concentric contraction, eccentric contraction, and isometric contraction, the other two we haven't talked about here. It's really concentric contraction only, the other two are actions. The contraction by definition is to shorten, okay? Not going to get too nitpicky with that, but that's technically true, even though some texts will refer to it as a contraction for all three, but really it's an action for all three. Now the concentric is also the acceleration of motion. You're moving something, okay? You're not slowing it down, you're not holding it still like the other actions, you're moving it. Technically you're changing its direction, because when you're concentrically activating, you're shortening a muscle against a resistance, because there is a resistance. That resistance is pulling against you. You're resisting the motion. It's trying to pull you one way, you're trying to go the other. So that's what makes it the most effort required to occur with that same load, okay? Now, isometric is easier. Now, instead of trying to bring it up, you're just holding it still. That's easier to do because you're actually not trying to move it. You're trying to maintain its position. You're trying to resist it from going toward the direction it wants to go or is being pulled, so to speak. You're trying to resist that, but you're no longer trying to move it. So it's actually easier. Isometric or stabilizing is easier than accelerating something. And then as you're maintaining the length under resistance. And then eccentric or negative acceleration, technically, also referred to as deceleration, less technically correct, but true. We often use that phrase. The muscle's now lengthening under resistance, which means you're actually going toward the direction of the resistance. You're going with it, so to speak, but you're slowing it down and controlling it to a certain extent. That is the easiest thing to do. But it's also why some people often say you're stronger eccentrically. No, you're not. You're actually exerting less force eccentrically than you were isometrically. And isometrically, you're exerting less force than you were concentrically. Okay? It's important to have that differentiation clear. 1 max testing is really typically absolute strength testing. The NSCA, the National Strength Conditioning Association, has some pretty good protocol for doing this. Expectation being 3 to 4 days of rest before you do it. We want 72 to 96 hours between to allow for proper glycogen development, glycogen storage for overall longevity of performance, even though this is not glycogen specific, but you want to be able to make sure your body has what it needs for hormonal balance. Want to make sure you're rested, you're motivated. Don't want to be doing anything that's going to be fatiguing you or affecting your ATP replenishment, affecting your muscles' capacity to produce force. So you want 3 to 4 days rest prior to actually gauging it to get maximal accuracy and maximal performance. Set number 1 should be light resistance, something you can do probably 5 of 10 reps or so, okay, with 60 seconds rest following, because it's light, right? We don't need full ATP, so we can rest for 60 seconds. Set 2, high resistance now, 3 to 5 reps, looking for at least 3, maybe as many as 5. Adding 5 to 10% more load than your first set was, whatever it was, where you could do 5 to 10 reps. By the way, if your first set you were wrong, you did 15 reps, that load was so easy, then you probably need to add more than just 5 to 10%. That's a general number. It's a pretty good basis. You got to be careful with adding too much per set because you could actually hurt someone or you could get hurt, but that's a pretty good number. 5 to 10% more for loading for upper body and 10 to 20% more than that first set for the lower body, and rest 2 minutes, okay? We haven't done anything terribly strenuous yet. That's why 2 minutes rest is still recommended, probably for getting at least all creatine phosphate back for those 3 to 5 reps you did. Set 3, 2 to 3 reps now. So we're getting slowly toward that 1 rep, right? It's getting a little more intense. The load has now gone up again. So this third set is again adding 5 to 10% more load upper body wise and 10 and 20% more load lower body wise to whatever the second set was. Doing 2 to 3 reps, waiting 2 to 4 minutes, going to your fourth set, which could be your own last set you do. 1 rep max now, by again 5 to 10% more than your upper body set. Then set 3, and 10 and 20% more than what it was for your lower body for that third set there. And if you can do the rep, you got 1 rep, fantastic. You rest a full, it should say a 2 to 4 minute rest again. Okay, 2 to 4 minute rest again here. And then you do set 5 and repeat essentially what set 4 was up to set 6. If you can still do 1 rep max, this whole thing, you had it incorrect from the standpoint of the loading you were doing. It was too easy. You were engaging it properly. If you could do set number 6, 1 rep, no problem at all, then the beginning of the lifting was probably way too easy. You probably did 10 reps with ease or more, and you probably want to find an exercise that load for next time that you can adjust. The very first time this is done, it can be a little bit off, okay? But you don't want to be trying to do set 7, 8, 9, 10 because fatigue is going to set in. So even though muscular strength may be at a higher level than what loads you were showing before because you actually get to handle more load, you're also going to be fatiguing, so it's not going to be an accurate number, okay? pretty good protocol for 1 rep max strength testing. Again, you got to be motivated, rested, and have previous lifting experience before such kind of training. Otherwise, a high chance of DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, or injury to connective tissue, which is really not a good thing. The best way to strengthen connective tissue is as a high load, basically low speed type work. And whereas compressive force activity is the best for bone density, but either way, high loads are going to help both, assuming you have control. If you don't have control of the motion, if you have clearly have one side stronger than the other and you're lifting with a barbell, you might want to suggest either not doing barbell training. Do you have to do a maximum bench press with a barbell? Can you do dumbbells? Even though that protocol is typically follows a barbell bench press, and most people want to use, we'll talk about this with the resistance tools, a barbell over a dumbbell, because it actually is much more stable. It's a closed chain activity now, so basically your stronger arm can help your weaker arm. Whereas if you have 2 dumbbells, your stronger arm can't help your weaker arm. Okay, that's one of the benefits or drawbacks, all depending on the exercise. Dynamic exercise is constant motion versus static is isometric. If you're ever in any sport or activity whereby, and the textbook refers to like wrestling, where there's significant periods of time where you might be in isometrically need, and I have an isometric need for strength. In other words, you're in positions where you're holding for long periods, or you're grappling in the same position for a long period of time, then performing more activities from isometric standpoint might not be a bad idea. However, a lot of sports are more geared toward the benefit of constant motion. You want to be thinking about that, with your training stimulus from the standpoint of performing more dynamic motion. From a general standpoint, a lot of static strength is very advisable for teaching stabilization, teaching some aspects of balance, and actually helping train motor control and development over time, or maybe even during the warm-up type phases. But from a standpoint of typical performance, most cases you're looking for more of the dynamic strength, the activity itself, motion, not holding in place for long periods. But that's definitely sport-specific or need-specific. Isotonic or constant force machines will have to be, the only thing is can do this, or the force is the same. You might say, well, a dumbbell is constant force. No, the load is constant. However, depending upon the angle of your position in space, when you move it, when you're moving it, that's going to be a difference in different needs in force application, because the resistance is going to change. Okay, most cases in most situations, unless you're talking about some machines and the way they're built, resistance will change throughout a motion in loaded type exercises. So you're not going to see constant motion, constant force isotonically or constant speed isokinetically unless you're using a machine that's specifically designed for that. Those machines are great to be able to measure your force capacity or your ability to produce force against the constant speed for testing purposes, and they're kind of expensive pieces of equipment, so it's kind of hard to come by. They're not necessarily perfectly applicable to sport. From a standpoint of sports motions are not, they're just never at constant force positions or constant speed, not for any length of time. So consequently, that may not have a high application there, but it's useful for testing and understanding more about your athlete or the person you're training and their capacities for stress. Plyometric is explosive. Yuri Verkhoshansky, the person who came up with the concept of plyometrics, the Russian, would be very upset if you tried to do plyometric exercise and you weren't explosive with doing it. It's not plyometric if it's not explosive. It needs to have a very, very short response time, very limited time on the ground, and be exploding off of a surface it's as much as explosive as possible. We'll talk more about that. Expectation for choice tests should be, again, relative to the movements desired. Too often people do it based upon what muscle they want. Most performance is not based in muscle, it's based in movement. And by basing on the proper movement, you'll get the right muscles involved. However, if you try to do work on just getting the right muscles involved, you won't necessarily get the right movement. Consequently, you won't have the same transfer of performance, the same recognition of performance benefit. So that's important to understand those differentiations as well. Okay. And of course, the appropriate energy system usage that you're looking for, specificity, specific to energy systems you're going to use. There are sports like hockey and basketball and soccer and other sports too that have relative variations in energy systems needs depending upon your position in the sport, depending upon how your team plays the sport, depending upon how the game is going, if it's being dictated by the other team and how they play. All those things can play a difference with understanding that there's variable needs in a lot of sports for all energy systems to some extent. Too often times people will say, you got a baseball player or a football player, it's all ATP, CP, or about glycolytic or aerobic type training. Like, well, depends on your athlete you're talking about. Your pitcher up there on the mound, if the pitcher in baseball is there for a long, long time, to become more and more aerobic, they're up there, right? Depending upon their rest time between, it could be going more toward aerobic type work. It could be going more toward, it's not going to be ATP, CP for very long, because at that point, they're not resting long enough to get 90 seconds or more rest between pitches. So consequently, it's actually a lot more toward glycolytic and or aerobic for that starting pitcher in a lot of cases. At least after the more successive pitches the person throws, the more and more goes from being less explosive more toward aerobic and so on down the road. And of course, that's one of the benefits of a good pitcher. An example is one that doesn't lose velocity over longer periods of time on the mound. They actually can maintain near maximal capacity for longer periods, just like an endurance athlete can have their lactate threshold be possibly consistent with their VO2 max, or at least close to it, whereas deconditioned individuals have a VO2 max lactate threshold of 40-50% of the VO2 max. The aerobic elite athlete could have an 85 to 100% lactate threshold relative to VO2 max. Likewise, a pitcher with a high capacity, elite capacity, might have their lactate threshold, so to speak. It wouldn't be called lactate threshold, but from a standpoint of recognition wise, they can keep repeating that pitch every 30 seconds, repeating that pitch for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on pitches. Their threshold capacity is extremely high relative to their maximal performance. Okay. Assessing power. There should be 3 to 4 days, again, rest preceding for maximal power, the ability to exert force quickly. Vertical jump test we talked about already, the maximal jump height or explosiveness, jumping three jumps, and the maximal capacity for the height or hip displacement for a specific equipment you can place on the hip. And actually, if you're doing some tests, you might want to have them reach up and actually be up on their toes and understand their maximal reach before you jump. Not a bad idea, right? But that's useful if you're in any sport, certainly a volleyball, a middle blocker, an outside hitter in volleyball for sure, or a power forward or a center, or even almost any basketball player really, to some extent, vertical jump test be useful. Certainly some players more than others, and same with those sports. Might see a high usefulness for this. Standing broad jump make more sense when you're not really so much concerned about your vertical per se, but you do want to see if someone has maximal capacity to explode, and seeing their maximal jump distance from a standing broad jump perspective is one possible test you can use. And we actually talked about the other tests, new multiple other choice options as well, with like the box jumps, the 3-box jump as another option, which can be very technically challenging, but certainly can be a useful test as well. These are more typical field tests you'll see out in the field when they don't have as much equipment to be able to use, right? Medicine ball throws from a seating position or a kneeling position or a standing position, whatever's most useful for measurement for the person you're measuring with. Measuring for explosive upper body power, much more useful than someone trying to explode with a heavy load, whereby that's not really pertinent to sport. The standpoint of explosiveness in sport, your bat is not that heavy. The ball you're throwing is not that heavy. So consequently, the need for having ridiculous level of loads while trying to produce power is really not as significant as it can often seem for a lot of people when they try to train toward power. You want to reduce the loads, try to increase the speeds. Okay. In which case, by the way, medicine ball throws, we should say 1K to 5K, what's typically recommended for the loads you throw. 40-yard dash, how fast can you get 40 yards is typically used in a lot of combines for the NFL because it's indicative that linear speed is not the end-all be-all. Some people make it too much, but it is a measure of your running speed, and it's a good one in that respect. Some people use even a 30-yard because they want to measure even closer to the ATP measurement, and so be it. Maybe it's a 10-yard to see the explosiveness off the line for any particular sport where that's necessary. But assessing power also, some machine can measure constant force application against maximal speed of motion. So it'll give you a force that will not change, and you have to move it as fast as possible. And that's kind of a very controlled way to be able to measure someone's power. However, it also assumes that your motion is going to be indicative of the exact way that that machine allows you to move, and that may or may not be consistent with the training stimulus you'd be getting or your performance need as well, something to take into account. Assessing muscular endurance, looking at about 2 to 3 days rest between for this, because it's obviously not nearly as intensive as your power and your maximal strength. You're looking for the ability to sustain force output over longer periods. Okay, muscular endurance in general means sustaining force over longer periods. The NFL uses a 225-pound bench press for as many reps as possible. How many times can you do that? That's what they use for their assessment of muscular endurance from an upper body muscular endurance standpoint. Some will argue that you laying on a bench, pushing load up off of you is not really indicative of you standing up in the sport of football and performing in that way, and so it's not really indicative of actual sport performance. Can't disagree with that necessarily. The question is it a measure of someone's improvement in training? So consequently, is there a transfer? And there is some. I think it's inarguable there is some. Well, is there a need to do more than just that kind of training? Absolutely. But for that to be a part of it, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there's no question that's not indicative by itself of a better football player. But I don't think that was intended to be the goal. Another test to assess some aspect of someone's capacity for handling stress and their ability to be an elite athlete, right? We often use more push-ups and pull-ups. How many push-ups can you do? Your own body weight. How many pull-ups can you do? Your own body weight. Pull-ups are always more difficult to do than push-ups, because push-ups, you're not doing an inverted handstand type push-up. That'd be a different story. Balance would also be an issue in that respect, not just the load itself. Whereas a pull-up, you're trying to pull your body weight. So clearly the heavier the person, the harder it is, both push-ups and pull-ups. But those are options. And of course, when people can't handle their own body weight, loaded chest presses for 1/4 to a half their body weight for a pull-up, or for a chest press, or a pull-down, are reasonable ways to go in a fitness testing atmosphere for potential just recognition of someone's basic capacity for work. Down the road, we want them to do more and more sophisticated and less subjective tests, but for the very beginning, to get some basic ideas what they're capable of, not a bad idea. Leg pressing or squatting, the same load as their body weight, as many reps as possible, is also a common one performed for assessing muscular endurance. And that's basically what we're going to cover for now. It's on next week in week 13, the first videos we have up there on Monday, maybe early Tuesday at the latest. For the first video next week, we'll be finalizing chapter 7, talking more towards prescription and designing programs from an anaerobic perspective a little more broadly. Okay, your grades are visible, they will be visible and updated fully by the end of tomorrow, Saturday, but I'll be working through the weekend, through everything through week 11. I will also have your questions for you by some point on Saturday. So I want you to get back in there to respond to my questions so you can actually maximize your grade and your performance as well. Keeping in mind, again, reminding you, you can go back and actually update your any point lost for not properly citing APA format. You can get that point back, no problem. Got to redo it. And I will tell you again, if you put it in there and I haven't upgraded your score in a couple 2-3 days, you might want to look in the comments, because I probably told you still didn't get it. And it's really important that you do cite it properly. Once you get it down one time, it's a piece of cake every time. But if you're a little bit off, or if you looked in the wrong place the first time to get it, it seems tedious trying to get it down. I understand that. But that said, it needs to be cited properly. You can't go back and put more comments in to each other. So the points you lost for not commenting to other people, getting 2 interactions, you can't make those points up. You can make up at least half, up to half, I should say, of the points lost content-wise. So you can still do that, but you can't make up full points, because that wouldn't be fair to everybody who turned their work in on time and performed to a reasonable level at the time work was due. But I want to give you the opportunity to make up some of that. You can't make it all back, though. Okay. So you've got ahead of you, essentially, the grading for this week and finalizing your post for this week, week 12. Then you got 4 more after that. You got a research paper coming up with it's already, by the way, it's been in course announcements for the entire semester. Some people were concerned about their paper. It's been there for a long time. And that's okay. I wasn't expecting it from you. I think the challenge is, sometimes when I say something like a paper is due, and then your brain goes into hyperactive mode, like, what paper, when, what to do, what do you have to do? It's okay. You can have time with this. It's not going to be an outrageously long, extensive paper. It's a few pages. It's expected to be a high quality paper. It's 15% of your grade, but it's not going to be some monumental excessive effort. If you're starting with the research this week to make sure you get clear on what title you want to have, and actually be trying to put together maybe your abstract, your first page, your cover page, and get that kind of put together a little bit, and some ideas, and getting some research articles you're going to be using, some basic data, taking some notes, getting it started this week and next week, so that by basically that third week, essentially before 419, you got a first draft put together, and you're going to be I'm going to be telling you, I'm going to be getting the papers from you, and I'm going to have you also give me a copy of your first draft, and you're also going to give a copy of your first draft to one of your fellow students, and I'll tell you who that's going to be, and we'll get that to them as well to grade and review, and they'll get it back to me and you, so you can see that, so you can adapt to that. You're not going to get graded on on what they graded you against you on. They're going to get graded on if they made effort to actually really help you with your paper. So your grade is going to be, it's going to be your lab for that week, by the way, how effectively you assess someone else's peer, how much you as a peer review their research paper to help them. I'm not expecting you to be the instructor, the professor, to go to the nth degree of explanation, but I'm also going to give you some pretty good guidelines to be able to use to be able to help break down what they need to be working on for their final draft, to help them make a better paper for their final draft come a week and a half-ish after that when they turn it in, okay, for the final paper. One more exam, similar to your first two exams, non-cumulative for chapter 7 through 10, which, by the way, are going to be the least tactical of the chapters we've had thus far. I made adjustments to everyone's scores by 2-3 percentage points at least for everybody, based upon a couple questions that I threw out because too many people missed them. I'll talk a little about those too, and I take a look at some of those questions into something we talk about next week. But other than that, those are the adjustments for your second exam. And then prep for your third exam, let me know if you have questions about it going into it, but it's going to be a similar format. And of course, our final project, which you will have to do based upon some aspects of things we've been learning all along, it will be the equivalency of your final. It'll be due to finals week. That's what we have coming up. Again, I hope you're doing well. Please don't make the mistake of not touching base with me if you have concerns. Several of you have. I have no problem with that. The worst thing you can do is to internalize it and make the assumption that you just have to figure it out and try to be able to not to get it figured out, and then go to somebody else who can't help you because they're not the professor. Everyone has had at some point whereby you have created something and someone else has trouble with it, and they go to somebody else and complain about it rather than coming to you when you're the one that can help them most. And maybe it's because, maybe they're concerned, or in this case, if we're talking about you're concerned. Professor Baines is not going to want to help me, or Professor Baines won't be able to give me what I need. Have you tried? That's what we have to do. In our job, and I work at Concordia University, if I ever have a concern, thankfully I haven't had to do it, but I needed to go to my chairperson, and that chairperson, of course, would need to go to the person above them. We have to use the channels we have available to us to let those people help us. If we've given them reasonable opportunity to help us and they don't or can't, we seek other help. Okay. But that being said, we have to give everybody the opportunity to do so, just like I want to give you the opportunity to do well, and I want you to do well in this class and get a lot out of it. I appreciate all the efforts you're making. I was very impressed with the last couple weeks of posts. There were a couple of down weeks in between. I think it was during the transitional time we had with a lot of things going on. There's opportunities to make everything up. You still got essentially not quite half your points available. You've got a little over half your points have been graded. You're probably looking at about 55-ish% of your score has been accumulated now up through week 11. And a little over 40% of it left to go. Okay. Call me or email me if you have questions. I'll help you however I can. Take care of yourselves. Be smart. Be good. And we'll talk to you again soon.